Welcome to Chapter 13, Part 2. As we said, the Civil War was more than just about slavery. It was a conflict of morals, values, beliefs in God versus the economy, self-interest, egos, and greed. We talk about the economy. We know that the North was an industrial civilization. We know the South was a agrarian civilization, farming industries. Self-interests. We know that the southern states wanted to maintain and keep slavery as a way to keep the economic engine running down there. And so it becomes a matter of greed as well, because if you get rid of the slaves in the South, well, then who's left to take care of the plantations and whatnot? So the issues, number one, of course, again, we say slavery, a moral issue versus an economic issue. A moral issue as in um, Christians, in the fact that God put people on earth, mankind, and it is not the right of mankind to enslave each other versus we need to keep slaves in the South to keep the economic engine running. Constitutional disputes. We talk about the federal law versus the states' rights and how they interact and how they step on each other's toes versus what's called the law of nature. And again, my seniors will know and understand more about the law of nature, but just basically how things work in the world without even the thought or notion of having a governmental system. Um, just how things run, how things are naturally done in the world. We know that in South Carolina, their rights were violated or supposedly violated by the imposing of extra tariffs. And so the South Carolina wanted to secede, and there was a whole big mess down there. And so it becomes a slavery and constitutional fight. Economic differences. Again, we know the North is industrial, the South is agricultural. There was additional tariffs placed on states placed on different products coming in out of the North and the South. The rationale and idea for a banking system and how it should be ran, and just the internal improvements, the infrastructure of the nation. Do we spend millions of dollars in railroads? Do we spend millions of dollars to purchase additional lands? Do we spend millions of dollars to create canals and such that improve the lives? You have some constitution or some congressional people that would like to improve society. Then you have people that just want to keep the status quo and keep things kind of the way they were. No reason to build railroads and things like that. And of course, there was a political blunders and extremism in the fact that there was a lot of corruption going on during this time, just like today. The Wilmot Proviso Review Act. It excluded territories from excluded slavery from new territories. It would go against the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, which ultimately said that for every slave state that's admitted, there should be a free state admitted to the Union. It was ultimately defeated. So the question becomes, what do we do with the Western territories? There's a huge chunk out west. If you look on Chapter 13, Part 1 series, the maps, you can see there's a large, huge area that's unsettled. And it becomes unsettled for many, many years simply because people are heading all the way out west to California where the gold rush was. And so how do we take these territories that are out west? How do we break them up into small manageable chunks? How do we decide if they're a slave state, if they're a free state? What do we do? How do we do all this and maintain some kind of civility in America? The Free Soil Movement, founded in 1840 in Buffalo, New York. It included members of the Conscious Whigs Party, Democrats, and members of the Liberty Party. The motto was free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. Well, based on that, you can pretty much ascertain that they like freedom. It was a third party whose main purpose was opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories acquired after the War with Mexico. The party argued that free men on free soil was a morally and economically superior system to slavery. The notion of God played a huge role in this, in the sense that, um, again, we should not enslave mankind because that's not what we're put on earth to do. We're put on earth to take care of nature, to take care of things on earth, to take care of each other. The party agreed ultimately on the Wilmot Proviso and tried removing existing laws that discriminated against freed African Americans. The political party only lasted about 4 to 5 years, and the party's main headquarters was located primarily in New York, where, of course, we know that was a free state, and so I don't think they really recognized the issues at hand from a Southern's point of view. I don't want to say they were dumb or stupid, but I want to say that they were maybe somewhat ignorant to the ideas that the South was proposing. And I'm not saying that the South was proposing great ideas, but I think it was a matter of sitting down with each other and kind of hashing it all out and seeing it from another person's point of view, kind of stepping in their shoes. The party membership was absorbed by the now Republican Party at its founding in 1954. So the Southern's position, take away or restrict slavery is a violation of our constitutional rights, taking away of private property. What I encourage you to do is take a look in the Constitution, and is there anything in the Constitution that says anything about private property? Number one. Number two, I would encourage you to take a look at the Constitution and see if there's anything in the Constitution that says something about people can be enslaved and that they can be private property. And also their position was they favored extending the Missouri Compromise westward all the way to California. Lewis Cass, this may be a person that you've heard of in maybe Michigan history or past historical classes. And I know somebody's going to ask me, why do they always put their hand inside their vest or inside their coat? I'm not really sure. The only thing I found was that their timepiece, their pocket watch, so to speak, was always located in a small breast pocket just inside there. So I'm not exactly sure why people pose like that. Side note, I got diverted, sorry. He was the first governor of the Michigan Territory. He was not the first governor of the state of Michigan, but the Michigan Territory. He was the Secretary of War under Jackson. Of course, we remember Jackson as Old Hickory and the guy who just loves a good war. He was a U.S. Senator. He ran for president but lost to Zachary Taylor. And ironically, he was one of two people that actually ran for president from the state of Michigan. How about this? Lewis Cass says, how about we let the people vote on these new settled territories instead of us congressional people? Let the people in the individual states cast their vote for if they want to be a free state or if they want to be a slave state. Now remember, at the time, black people could not vote, women could not vote, but men could. And at this time, it was all men, not just wealthy white landowners or landowners. It could be any male at this time of age. So it was kind of breath of fresh air that we let the people decide rather than the people in Washington, D.C. decide what's best for a territory that is thousands of miles away from the capital. So the North and South was somewhat in favor. They both kind of liked the idea. They thought, that seems kind of fair. However, what's going to happen is if the people vote for a particular area to be a slave state, well, you're going to upset some people in the North. And if they vote to be a union or is a free state, you're going to upset people in the South. So it sounds good on paper, but when you actually put the notion in place, it doesn't go quite as well as planned. And this idea of letting the people vote on the issues was called the squatter sovereignty or the popular sovereignty. The idea that the people of that particular area get to decide. So let's just take an area like Montana, for example. Um, the people of Montana would be actually able to vote and decide whether it's a free state or a slave state. Seems pretty easy. The idea that the very people who live there get to make those decisions versus people in Congress. The next slide is going to show you the results from the 1848 presidential election. And this image you see here on the left-hand side is Zachary Taylor and Henry Fillmore. This is a political banner that they used, can be found at the Smithsonian Museum. And you can see that Zachary Taylor and Henry Fillmore, I was thinking something else. Henry Fillmore is a musician. Millard Fillmore, excuse me. Looks like they received 163 of the votes. Democrat Lewis Cass and William Butler, 127. And the Free Soil Party, Martin Van Buren, versus Charles Adams. Of course, we see that the Free Soil Party received 0 electoral college votes, which tends to be pretty typical in elections because they don't get the most traction, they don't get the most attention, they don't have the funding to get their word, get their idea out there. So it becomes really a matter of Democrats versus Whigs. Again, we said that Whigs eventually become the Republican Party in 1854. So the election of 1848 becomes the first election to use what we know today as the current system of electing. So we know that elections are always the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. We also say that Zachary Taylor dies while in office and Fillmore takes over as vice president, but eventually becomes president. And during this time, Florida, Iowa, Texas, and Wisconsin become states during this election cycle, which adds more electoral college votes. Florida being a Confederate state, Texas being a Confederate state, Wisconsin becoming a free state, and Iowa becoming a free state. Party beliefs at the time. Again, this was an assignment that you guys had in Google Classroom. The Compromise of 1850. This compromise consisted of 5 laws passed in 1850 that dealt with the issue of slavery and territorial expansion, which was at the very heart of the nation at the time. So as part of the compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act was amended and the slave trade in Washington, D.C. was abolished. Remember, the Fugitive Slave Act was an act that people could go out, they could capture slaves that were on the run, turn them in, and receive a little bit of money for that. So this act required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. So you have a slave that was on the run, made it all the way to Michigan. If you made it to Michigan, chances are you were going to make it eventually to Canada, where you know you'd be free forever. If you were left in the States, there's a good chance you'd be captured, caught, and returned. But if you made it to Canada, you were golden. And so if you could wait until the wintertime and wait until Lake Erie froze over, if you could somehow run across Lake Erie, I know that's easier said than done, but if you could get across Lake Erie into Canada, you were basically guaranteed freedom forever. This act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying the escaped slaves. So now the federal government gets involved with this whole issue. And again, is this a federal issue? Is this a state issue? Or is this a law of nature issue? Well, this compromise bought some time for the Union to work out some details before a pending war does come. So the 5 points of the compromise. Number 1, we admit California is a free state. We divide the remainder of the Mexican cession into 2 territories, Utah and New Mexico. And we allow the settlers to decide slavery by majority vote. Again, that's squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty, excuse me. We give the land in dispute between Texas and New Mexico territory to the new territories in return for the federal government assuming Texas's public debt of $10 million. So remember, Texas was a basically independent nation, Texas Republic. we as the United States government are going to assume that debt. We're going to ban slave trade, not banned, ban slave trade in DC, but we permit whites to hold slaves as they were before. So we can still have slavery in DC, we just can't have slave trade in DC. And we adopt a new, more stringent fugitive slave law, and we also enforce it more so. It was on the books for many, many years, not enforced perhaps as much as it could have been. It's kind of like writing a new law, but not really enforcing the law. Well, now we're going to tweak the law, or the fugitive slave law, and we're going to enforce it for sure. And finally, we have in this series the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It allowed people in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. The act also served to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery north of latitude 36 degrees 30 degrees. And again, the Missouri Compromise only went so far west. And the idea of allowing people to choose was a nail biter. Do the people really know what they want or not? So a couple of these states become border states, and they become contentious hot points in the Civil War. So Congress has this little internal fighting going. Do we really let the people decide if they're going to be a free state or not, or should we just decide that? Because remember, one free state gets in, one slave state gets in. If we have too many free states get in, it's going to upset the balance of the slave states, and we could have a huge um, union of free states and a small little pod of Confederate slave states. So we want to try to keep that balance as best as possible. And so, again, Congress is not really sure, should we let the people do this or not? And that becomes one of the smoking guns for the Civil War. This concludes this series of Part 2, Chapter 13.